Joining us now, former Prime Minister of Israel, Ehud Barak. Mr. Prime Minister, thank you for being here. I want to clarify something that David Cameron said just a moment ago in talking about this idea of recognizing a Palestinian state at the UN. He said that there would be no recognition of such a state while Hamas remains in Gaza, but it has to be the long-term goal. What is your reaction to the U.S. and the U.K. even considering this?
I would prefer to see the Israeli government that sees eye to eye with the Biden administration as with Cameron, but unfortunately we don't have such a government. I read this morning the article of Tom Friedman describing the contours of a Biden doctrine, which resonates with the proposals of Cameron. I think that it's an extremely positive plan. I would recommend to Israeli opposition leadership, all those who oppose Netanyahu and his policies, to unite behind it and to give it very severe consideration. I would recommend to them to use the opportunity of a pause in the fighting that might take place as a result of the deal to release the hostages, to establish the earliest possible date for Israeli election. We are just after the most severe blunder in the history of the country. 3 out of 4 Israelis believe that Netanyahu is responsible, the man responsible for it, and most of them think that he has to resign. I think that that's a time to choose our way, and I would prefer the contours of Biden plan over anything that is proposed by Netanyahu and the Messianic racist members of his government.
So it's a big if whether Netanyahu will just resign. I think it would have to probably come after an outcry of force from the Israeli public to get him to do so. I mean, he doesn't look like he wants to go anywhere, especially considering that he's got those criminal cases in front of him. If there were a candidate on the ballot for the Israeli public that did support a two-state solution, do you think that the Israeli public would support that person?
I think that it won't be easier under the impact, which is still fresh in the collective psyche of the nation, of certain feeling of terrible disaster and humiliation and the need to revenge and so on. But I'm confident that if determined leadership would stand and say, Israel cannot hope for better proposal than this Biden doctrine, as Tom Friedman described it. And just a year ago, we would be happy to see the whole deal, both axes of moderate countries backed by the United States facing Iran, and the rogue of the axis of rogue states, Saudi Arabia joining the whole deal, the peace agreement, normalization, and so on, and Israel committed itself to the only viable long-term position, which is a two-state solution. The other position is a tragedy.
Yeah, one of the points made by Axios, and this was considered according to their reporting by the U.S. officials, was that the Saudis, in order to normalize, need there to be a Palestinian state or an irrevocable path toward a Palestinian state. One other question for you. The U.S. State Department has sanctioned a number of Israeli settlers in the West Bank for, they say, fomenting or committing violence against Palestinians within the West Bank. What's your reaction to that?
You know, I don't like the situation which led them to announce those sanctions, but I should admit that there are certain, most of the Israelis in the settlements are normal citizens, but there are extremists who behave in lawful ways against Palestinians, and I don't like the situation that we were caught in, but I can understand why normal people in democracy see that those individuals should be pointed to and identified without generalizing it on the whole population. And probably it's a painful but understandable treatment.
So President Biden signed an executive order to do this, to sanction those people. You have now the leaking of those conversations about recognizing a Palestinian state. What does it say to you about what President Biden is trying to say publicly to Netanyahu?
I think that President Biden is the most supportive president Israel ever had at the White House. And it cannot be exaggerated. The role, the devotion, the commitment that he took upon himself in spite of a kind of cold shoulder that he sees from Netanyahu and have seen in the past, even as a vice president. I think that independent of what Biden thinks about them, the Israeli public should remove Netanyahu, not Biden. And I think that it's very important that Biden describes or will describe in the near future a clear vision which America is ready to back. Israel has to make end to the reigning of Hamas and its military capabilities in Gaza. Israel does not have any interest in staying there for the long term. We have been there for decades and left for good reasons. So we have to find certain body with international legitimacy to whom we can hand over the Gaza Strip once we get rid of Hamas. And this should be, I see that the natural candidate is the Palestinian Authority. It should be revised. It should get clean out of certain elements of behavior which are unacceptable. It should be shaped in a way that will answer the legitimate security considerations of Israel, but there is no other legitimate power. Probably they should be helped in the first half a year or year by inter-Arab forces, but backed by Arab League and by the United States and the UK. I think that that's the only viable long-term position. You cannot bring Norwegians or Kazakhstani to run the Gaza Strip. It should be Palestinians.